The Prime Minister is set to join a phone call for the so-called Coalition of the Willing for peacekeepers in Ukraine, claiming Peter Dutton has walked away from bipartisanship on the conflict. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Fears over further US tariffs are building, with former Labor leader Bill Shorten calling on the government to institute reciprocal tariffs. The federal government has signalled it's most concerned about agriculture and pharmaceuticals because Australia sells a lot of those products to the United States. Are there any levers left for the government to pull? I'll ask my panel, Claire Armstrong and Mark Kenny. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will join a phone call with other world leaders tomorrow night to discuss potentially sending peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of the so-called Coalition of the Willing. The call comes as opposition leader Peter Dutton doubles down on not wanting Australian troops on the ground. Should we have a military presence in Ukraine? I'll ask Deputy Greens leader Mehreen Faruqi live in just a moment. And a cyber security expert has issued a warning over deepfakes this federal election, saying there was an urgent need for better detection tools. I'll speak to the CSIRO's cyber security expert about what needs to be done to prevent misinformation this election campaign. But first this afternoon, the Greens are questioning whether Labor rushed mandatory sentencing laws through Parliament under false pretences after the Dural caravan plot was revealed to be a hoax. Greens Senator Mehreen Faruqi has demanded the laws be revisited and repealed when Parliament next meets. She's also written to the Prime Minister urging him to take seriously a rise in Islamophobia in Australia, and she joins me in the studio. Senator, welcome.
Thank you, Patricia. Lovely to be here.
You want to repeal mandatory sentencing laws. Even if the caravan was a hoax, which the police have confirmed, it's hard to deny that anti-Semitism is and was on the rise, right?
Of course, anti-Semitism has been on the rise. Racism in general has been on the rise in Australia. The Greens have always been opposed to mandatory sentencing for good reason. Expert after expert tells us that they don't work, they are discriminatory and they are unjust. And what the Labor government did was backflip on their own policy, which is against mandatory sentencing, to do an 11th hour dirty deal with the Liberals to rush through these mandatory sentencing laws. They should never have been put in place. And in March, when we go back to a sitting, the government must come back and repeal these laws, because the Prime Minister does have questions to answer about the incident that rushed through this particular law.
But that wasn't just about that incident, right? There was a spate of anti-Semitic attacks. The ASIO Director General Mark Burgess, that's Australia's spy agency, of course, declared anti-Semitism as the top priority for his organisation in terms of threats to life. So it goes beyond the Dural case, doesn't it?
Well, it was the Dural case that rushed through these laws. And we also know that the criminal elements involved in many of these incidents, and most of them who are in custody at the moment are being questioned, there is not a single piece of evidence to say that they were doing those things because of an anti-Semitic ideology. That is what we found out today as well. Of course, we should have the strongest laws against racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, any kind. But we know that mandatory sentencing is not the answer to that. Is not the answer to anti-racism at all. So the Labor government was so scared of getting attacked from the Dutton Liberals that they did this dirty deal and rushed through those laws. Now they have questions to answer about if the AFP knew immediately that this caravan plot was a hoax, why did Labor actually whip up? Because that's when the media hysteria and the fear in the community was really whipped up. And they have to come clean about whether these laws were passed and rushed through because of that hoax.
Well, officials have pointed out there are other attacks, like the synagogue incident in Melbourne. That was a pretty disturbing incident. That was a synagogue put on fire. There was the torching of cars in Sydney's eastern suburbs. There's been graffiti even over the last couple of days. And then There was all of that vandalism on Josh Burns's office too, which was really disturbing. I know many of his staff were very, very worried. It was dangerous stuff. So there has been, it goes way beyond Dural, doesn't it?
Of course, Patricia, and those incidents are horrific and they are terrible. But we already had laws under which all of that can be addressed and tackled. We have criminal laws under which all of that can be addressed and tackled. We did not need unjust, discriminatory, last-minute laws passed through to be able to do that.
And do you think all of those laws were totally sufficient?
Well, when we actually supported the hate crimes bill in its original form, because it did expand protections for marginalised communities, particularly for trans communities and disabled people. So we did absolutely support that. What we did not support was this rush through mandatory sentencing.
No, I think you ultimately voted for the bill in the Senate, though, but after opposing...
After trying to get rid of those mandatory sentencing laws, because we did support the expansion of protections for marginalised communities.
You've also written to the Prime Minister urging him to take seriously a rise in Islamophobia in Australia. We've seen a recent report. There was obviously the high-profile attack on those two Muslim women in Melbourne. But what do you want him to do?
So, March 15th, which is tomorrow, is the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. It is also the 6th anniversary of the Christchurch Mosque massacre, where an Australian man with a far-right Islamophobic ideology and a white supremacist cold-bloodedly murdered 51 Muslims in a mosque. And you know what? That incident, that terror incident, changed the lives of every Muslim living in this country. And we had hoped that that would be a turning point. But sadly, that has not materialised. Because, you know, we still see Labour and Liberals denying the reality that Muslims face. You mentioned the Islamophobia Register report that came out yesterday. I mean, I was there at the release of the report. I was the only politician who was there to listen to what is going on for the Muslim community. You know, women are being punched in the face. Their scarves being torn off. We have had one Islamophobic incident every single day for the last 2 years. Where is the media reporting on it? Where is the Prime Minister saying that this is an urgency and an emergency? And we need to address this like any other form of racism. So I have asked the Prime Minister to acknowledge the breadth and depth of rising Islamophobia in this country, but also to very loudly reject the political narratives that are fueling and driving this hatred against Muslims and even Palestinians and Arabs in this country.
What political narratives are you asking him to denounce? What are you suggesting?
Well, over the last 18 months in particular, people who have stood up against a genocide have been vilified, have been gaslighted, have been silenced over all that time. And there, of course, there are political narratives of the protesters who are disturbing so-called social cohesion, or it is those people who are causing, everything bad that is going on in this country. But that's not the case.
And that does whip up. Protesters who absolutely have a right to protest and oppose the war. But there have been placards that have been used which have been pretty highly inflammatory. Aren't people right to be worried about that?
Well, people, of course, can, but it is not about vilifying a whole community, for what a couple of people might do. We have seen this massive rise in Islamophobia, and there is no discussion or acknowledgement for it. I think the Muslim communities are rightly feeling very frustrated and angry and betrayed. We are being left out in the cold, and there has been nothing that has acknowledged what is going on. The Prime Minister has actually a really good roadmap on how to deal with anti-racism, how to make this country anti-racist. We have the National Anti-Racism Framework that came out last year, which is an excellent document. The Prime Minister has not funded it, has not agreed to implement all the recommendations. That's the first step that the Prime Minister could take today or tomorrow to say that he will fully fund that framework to be implemented urgently.
Governments often respond to the advice that they're given. Given ASIO has said that it's anti-Semitism that is their biggest concern, the most overwhelming issue, isn't the Prime Minister and the political establishment, whatever you want to call them, responding to what they're being told by the experts?
Well, the experts are probably not 100% accurate on this. It is a very one-sided view of what racism in this country looks like.
So you think ASIO is wrong as well?
Well, what I'm saying to the Prime Minister is that Islamophobia is on the rise. It has really ticked up the incidents that people are facing. You know, there's been threats, violent threats in schools, in mosques. There's been absolutely horrific graffiti in so many places. So we need to look at racism as not as prioritizing different forms of racism, but actually dealing with it. And the roots of racism in this country need to start, or tackling racism in this country need to start with truth-telling for First Nations people.
Why don't just move to another issue if we can. The peacekeeping force, the Coalition of the Willing, which the Prime Minister's participating in a phone call on. Not a commitment yet from the Prime Minister, but he's going on this phone call, so obviously our government is very actively considering this. Is it a good idea?
I mean, obviously we need to do everything we can to see that peace prevails. The Ukrainian people have suffered too much and for too long. And let's see what these discussions that the Prime Minister is involved in lead to. But I actually don't think that sending our troops in harm's way is the answer to this. There is a war going on, an invasion happening. What we need to do is, and we can do that, is to de-escalate the situation. And the Prime Minister could actually strengthen sanctions. That some of the sanctions were put on Russia a while ago, but they can be strengthened. And one of the things the Greens called for very early on was to, stop oil imports from Russia, because they're still happening through third parties. So the Prime Minister needs to strengthen those sanctions. And I think any discussion about sending our troops into risks way needs to be done very, very cautiously.
Right, so you would be very, very reticent to support peacekeepers. This would obviously have to happen after there was a ceasefire. There's so many preconditions, but us participating in that.
We have to be very cautious about sending our troops in harm's way when there is a war going on.
Isn't it important, though, to defend the principle of what the Ukrainians are fighting for and being part of that?
Well, it is important to get peace there. That is the most vital thing. And, getting involved in war doesn't necessarily bring peace.
But is it being involved in war if it's a peacekeeping force?
Well, like I said, there is a war and invasion going on at the moment. So that would be sending our troops in harm's way. I want to wait and see what the discussions that the Prime Minister is having leads to, and then take a very cautious approach.
One more question. Bill Shorten today, I mean, he's no longer on the Labor front bench. He's now a university vice-chancellor, but he said that we should think about reciprocal tariffs on the US. Should we?
Well, again, I think we should not be so dependent and a doormat to the US, honestly. That's what we should be doing. There were so many instances recently when the Prime Minister could have called on the US or criticized the US for what they are doing, and those opportunities were missed. So I think that's the most important thing. We have to develop our own independent international foreign policy and not be a doormat and led by Trump in the US.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Patricia.
There are no laws governing truth in political advertising in Australia, which has, of course, big implications ahead of the federal election, in which deepfakes, hyper-realistic, digitally altered videos could play a big role in the spread of misinformation. CSIRO cybersecurity expert Dr. Sharif Abu Adabar has done research on deepfakes that shows many are able to outsmart detectors, and he's our guest. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, PK, for having me.
You're concerned about deepfakes outsmarting detectors. What kind of detection do we have in place right now?
So the recent deepfake detectors rely on AI to detect. So they basically build a model, that model trained on some samples, and then with the hypothesis that once that model deployed out there, it will help to detect the real-time deepfake. So what motivated our evaluation study is basically every week there is a new deepfake detectors coming up, but there is a lack of a unified framework to evaluate them all against each other. So why this is useful? Because diagnosis before cure. So we need to understand the resilience of those detectors in comparison to what we see emerging in the wild.
what actions can address the challenges posed by deepfakes, particularly in the context of this upcoming election where you have really acute concerns?
Deepfake, as you know, it's very challenging because the attackers are riding the advancement of the latest AI. So it's less likely will be a silver bullet, and it's less likely that there will be one, this problem will go anytime soon. So the best way probably to go about it is to have the multifaceted approach for short-term, medium-term, longer-term. Short-term is basically raising the public awareness, go with the strategy of trust but verify. But then for the medium and longer term, we need better detection, better tracking of the AI-generated content out there, all together.
What are some of the effective methods for improving detection and defence against the technology? And in your warning, what are you effectively asking of us all collectively to do?
As I said, I think for short term, we know the detectors are not up to speed. And in most of the cases, attackers, they are relying on propagating those information or misinformation, disinformation through the low-hanging fruit, I call it, which is the social media. So in social media, we have combined around 5 billion to 6 billion accounts. Anybody could post anything. So I would say at the start is basically the public need to be cautious, very vigilant. As I say, the trust but verify, no need to spread that information before you validate and cross-check. I think that's the public immunity. But then alongside that, we need also the science community also to step up the effort around the detection and attribution and so on.
Have you seen anything that's even tricked you?
I think the short answer is yes, and there is something interesting about the human as well. We might be tricked twice because we might think that we could detect because we rely on, like 5-6 years ago, it's very easily to see the deepfake through, for example, the pixels and how they place someone's face on someone else. But recently, with the advancement of AI, become very, very tricky. Some of them that even for the people who are working in the field might be challenges with your bare eyes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, if you're getting tricked, that really worries me because you're an expert. You say deepfake detection needs to focus on meaning, context, rather than just appearance, right? You've been saying that. Just explain how that works, because that's quite complex, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's a great question. So from the attacker perspective, they want one goal, which is you believe what you see in that sample, whether it's an image or a video. So we call that syntax. A lot of detectors coming up, they focus on the syntax with the image, which is basically falling a trap to what the attacker wants us to focus on. So what we mean by the meaning, again, this is a vision kind of, is basically we rely also on the context. And context means what is in that image or a video that could trigger someone? What is the context? Is it targeting a president, targeting another character? And then try to verify that information through other means. That could be some authentic sources from the government website or proper media outlet and so on. The AI might not be up to speed there, but that's where probably it will be very harder for the attacker to basically coordinate all that plot on the larger scale.
How have deepfakes been used in election campaigns overseas? Like, of course, the most obvious example is the recent US example. Do they have more advanced forms of detection?
That's a very good question. I think we have seen through the 2024, not just in the elections in the US, in the Europe, but also in other, we call them attack mediums like video, facial recognition, and audio, and so on. So there are deepfake used in the US space. Just one probably example was the Taylor Swift dressing in Uncle Sam urging the public, for example, to vote to a specific candidate and so on. In Europe, in the UK election, again, some interference to tamper with the campaigns of both candidates and so on. So, and more likely, we're going to see more of that in the next coming years.
There is another side to this. There's almost a flip side. For those of us who have become very worried about whether something is fake, there's also the disbelief and not wanting to trust anything. Should we worry about that?
I think that's an excellent question, because we don't want these segments to be fear-mongering, don't believe anything and all of that. I think we need to be rational. On the optimistic side, as mentioned earlier, it's basically for the public, we probably can go with the trust but verify. It's easily to see those samples on the social media. The big technology companies are struggling actually to keep up. But basically, if you looked at some of those samples before you believe them, probably you double check in somewhere else before you also share them and spread them. So I think that would be a very good strategy. And by the way, not necessarily just in social media. It could be, voice clone is another angle of deepfake coming up, which is through the telecommunication. Like someone could take a segment from your voice and play it to your relatives or something. Still not large scale, but that's another something. So in simple, if someone asking you for an action or something, you might want to also to verify. That's short term for the public. As I said, for the medium, longer term, for research community and the other stakeholders, we need more comprehensive approach to mitigate the rise of the deepfake and disinformation in the next couple of years.
We certainly do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, while the Australian government has decided not to impose any retaliatory tariffs on the United States, other countries have hit back with reciprocal tariffs, escalating the risk of a trade war and fueling inflation globally. But how is this playing in Donald Trump's own backyard? This week for the Insiders on Background podcast, David Spears speaks to the Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Strain, about how domestic dissatisfaction and political pressure could motivate the Trump administration to overturn their policy. Here's a sample before it goes live tomorrow.
We have to think about American consumers as well. Consumers are going to face higher prices when they go to the store. They're going to face higher prices at the grocery store. They're going to face higher prices when they go shopping for clothing. They're going to face higher prices when they buy anything that is imported. That's going to make.
And how long will that take to be felt, to be seen on the supermarket shelf, in the shopping aisle? And how are Americans feeling about that at the moment?
No, I think it will not take much time at all. When the tariffs kick in, they're going to pretty quickly show up in consumer prices. And your question is a good one. How are the American people feeling about it? So much has happened. I feel like we're living 1 month of history in every day. The president's proposed tariff plans fluctuate by the hour on some days. And so it's taken a little while for public opinion polling to catch up. But the most recent polling I saw was a CNN poll that showed that 61% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of tariffs. That is a solid majority of the American people.
That's before prices have actually gone up, right?
Before prices have actually gone up, exactly. So this is not going to be popular.
So will that change Donald Trump's mind? I mean, how influenced will he be by poll numbers like that? I mean, this was such a core part of his election campaign. Tariffs, the most beautiful word, or whatever it was, third or fourth most beautiful word
the most beautiful word in the English language.
So is he likely to shift on this if there is a really noticeable public backlash?
I think he is. I think that's kind of the $1 million question. A big part of the excitement that investors felt when President Trump won the election was based on the assumption that he would not go forward with policies that were inflicting severe economic damage for a long period of time. I think that's basically the right bet. I think the president is a true mercantilist. He genuinely and incorrectly believes that if the United States is running a bilateral trade deficit with another nation, that in a very real sense, the U.S. is losing economic value and that other nation is gaining economic value. And I think what he needs to do is put his hand on the hot stove. And that's, kind of what we're seeing, I think. The question is, how long does he have to keep his hand on the hot stove before he takes it off? My guess is that will be measured in weeks or months and not in years. But that's the question.
Well, and it's not just the opinion polls; it's the stock market too, right? Because we've seen that heading south rapidly this week as well.
Yeah, so where I am talking to you from, it's about 4:45 in the afternoon, and the market just closed here in the United States, and we are officially in a correction. The market is down 10% relative to its all-time high, which it hit just about 3 weeks ago. 10% of the value of the market has evaporated as a consequence of President Trump's pursuit of higher tariffs. That's a lot of money. That's
people's retirement savings too, isn't it?
People's retirement savings. It's people's net worth, and people aren't going to like that, and that's going to have a political effect.
So you think weeks, and we're talking weeks and months before you expect to see Trump change course somehow on this?
Yeah, that's my judgment. I mean, I think we're going to have some time for the data to catch up. And economic statistics are produced with a lag. If you want to know what effect are the tariffs or the discussion around tariffs having on the U.S. job market in the month of March, you're going to have to wait until late April to know the answer to that. If you want to know how our higher prices showing up for consumers, you're going to have to wait a few weeks to know that from the time the tariffs go into effect. What's this doing to consumer spending? You're going to have to wait a few weeks after the tariffs go into effect to learn that. And so there's going to be a lag built in. Same thing with public opinion. It takes time for pollsters to write their poll questions and issue their polls and tabulate the results. But I think what you're going to see is a situation where the president's approval rating goes down, where disapproval of his trade policy keeps climbing. And if he waits long enough, you're going to see economic effects. You're going to see consumers pulling back their spending. You're going to see prices rising, particularly of goods to which the tariffs are applied. And, this is going to have a political consequence. As the president's approval rating continues to drop and as economic pain continues to grow, that's going to create political pressure on Republicans.
And here are our top stories this half hour. The Prime Minister will speak with other world leaders tomorrow night to discuss the potential for sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. France, Germany, Italy and Canada will also be part of the call arranged by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. In the event of a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, opposition leader Peter Dutton says Australia should not send peacekeepers to the region. Former Labor leader Bill Shorten has suggested Australia should retaliate to Donald Trump's tariffs dollar for dollar. Mr Shorten, who left the parliament just weeks ago, says the government should push back and stand up to the US president. Donald Trump's latest trade threat is a 200% tariff on wines and other alcoholic products from the European Union. A US influencer who caused outrage with her wombat video has left Australia. Sam Jones, who describes herself as a wildlife biologist and environmental scientist, posted a video of her taking a baby wombat from its mother. The video prompted the government to review her visa, but Ms Jones left the country on her own accord this morning. The divide over Australia's role in the conflict in Ukraine has opened up among the two major parties, the coalition and the opposition. The opposition leader, Peter Dutton, today doubling down on the coalition's opposition to sending Australian troops to the war-torn nation as part of a peacekeeping force. He called the Prime Minister's willingness to consider the idea a thought bubble.
As Defence Minister, I was incredibly proud to stand with the Ukraine Ambassador to put the first load of Bushmasters into Ukraine, and we should continue to support Ukraine, but not with troops on the ground in Ukraine. This was a thought bubble by the Prime Minister. It was a distraction. The Defence Ministers tried to walk it back. Our priority is our country.
The Prime Minister, in response, accused the coalition of stepping away from bipartisan support for Ukraine.
I won't preempt what comes out of that meeting, but Australia has, of course, stood with Ukraine since the beginning of this process. It did have a bipartisan position. It appears that Mr Dutton has walked away from that. That's a decision for him. But we stand with Ukraine, and we stand against and remain committed to opposing the actions of Vladimir Putin.
To discuss this and the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war, let's bring in the Ukrainian Ambassador, Vasyl Myroschnychenko. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Patricia.
Peter Dutton says joining the coalition of the willing is just a thought bubble from the Australian Prime Minister. Is it a real proposal? What have you established about Australia potentially looking at this option?
Oh, just to clarify, because coalition of the willing is not necessarily means only the boots on the ground. Coalition of the willing is solidifying support for Ukraine among the countries who believe that support for Ukraine is in their national interests. And I think in this respect, both on a coalition or a Labour side, there is total unity, because both sides of politics believe that more support should be provided to Ukraine in terms of military equipment, in terms of money or contributions to demining or Ukraine's rebuild or reconstruction. So I don't see any divergence among that. There could be a question, and we see that there is a divergence on potential deployment of the ADF in Ukraine. But at this stage, I think it's just too early to discuss it and debate it, because we are still too far from the moment when actually they could be deployed, because we need to achieve a ceasefire or that would be lasting, or at least a truce, and we don't yet see it coming, because the troops can be only deployed once the hostilities end, and that may take a while. And then, of course, there will be requests made. And, of course, Ukraine will be relying primarily on the European troops, French and British and others. So we will work on that. But what's important for Ukraine is to maintain bipartisan support for Ukraine here, and I believe, I'm convinced we have it, to make sure that we will work with you on defending democracy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there's bipartisan support for Ukraine and a denouncement of Russia as the aggressor. That's absolutely right. But there is a divergence, as you say, on boots on the ground. It seems to me now that the Albanese government is considering boots on the ground, not just being part of the coalition of the willing as an idea. Would you like to see Australian boots on the ground?
I think it would be the matter for the government to make that call. And more so, the discussions are still ongoing. I'm very pleased that Prime Minister is capable of taking part in the summit tomorrow. As you know, taking part out of Australia is always punishing because of the time difference, and I'm very pleased that he will find time to join leaders tomorrow. What's important for me as an ambassador in Ukraine is to make sure that Australia continues supporting us on the military side, because your Bushmasters have been saving many lives, and we will welcome more of those Bushmasters out there. Should the government decide to send troops, we'll certainly welcome them. As you know, ADF is already training Ukrainian soldiers for the past 3 years, and they've been doing it in the UK. And we will forever be thankful to Australian government, to Australian people for their support.
So does it matter to you? I know it's a later down the road discussion, but does it make a difference to you whether the support for Ukraine is expressed in the form of boots on the ground or other forms of support?
I think we're dwelling too much on this question because, Patricia, we have just to look at a bigger picture because, look, why Australia is supporting Ukraine. Australia is supporting Ukraine and Australia is supporting Europe because Europe now needs Australia because Australia may need Europe in the future. Because we are talking about security and safety and stability in Europe. And we see how it is impacting stability and security in Europe. Let me tell you, one of the commanders the other day in Ukraine mentioned that North Korean troops are much more effective than the Russian troops. And let me tell you, it's a very dangerous signal to you here, because if North Koreans are more effective than Russians, next thing they're going to do, they're going to invade South Korea. And that's going to bring lots of instability in the Indo-Pacific, and everybody's going to be hurt. So I think we're in the same boat together with Australia, making sure that might does not prevail, making sure that we can get back to the rules, actually. And I think Australians, like any other people, actually understand what we are facing. We're facing a bully, a dictator who wants to actually complete his imperialistic mission of destroying Ukraine. And I think we are standing together strongly, and I'm extremely grateful to both Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition for their support for the past 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. There is absolutely the kind of support we've seen from both sides. I think it's very important that we do highlight that, because it's different in different places, but in Australia that has been consistent. You mentioned that you would welcome Australian boots on the ground. I know I'm dwelling on this, but I'm dwelling on it for a good reason. Our Prime Minister has opened the door to this idea, and so, you know, we are interested in what might happen. Would you welcome it as an expression of extra Australian solidarity to your country and on this issue?
I think the way it works, it's now, as you know, this past week, the chiefs of defense in Europe were meeting, and I believe there were representatives of Australia there. Also, defense ministers met in the other day in Paris. And now they are kind of trying to figure out the framework of how these troops could be deployed. And I think we cannot really discuss it at the moment until the framework is developed, and then countries will be requested to make their commitments or make their decisions on this. I think let's discuss it when it comes to that time, because I don't think it's useful to discuss it at this moment. More so, I think Australia can play a much bigger role in all other respects of helping Ukraine, as you've been doing, by providing some of the military equipment, by providing ammunition, helping us with demining, or helping us develop those critical minerals that we badly need to develop to help rebuild the country. And I think let's focus on that one as well.
So obviously this all is predicated on the biggest question of all, which is how Russia responds. Vladimir Putin says he's in favour of a ceasefire. Do you believe him?
We don't trust Vladimir Putin, to be frank, and we have a reason for that. He waged this war for the past 11 years. In the period of 2014, 2021, 22, he broke ceasefire 25 times. So we don't really trust Putin, but we're now trying to build confidence. And I think the fact that Ukraine has agreed to an interim ceasefire for 30 days is a good step forward. We need to get our prisoners of war back. We need to get our children back. Russians have kidnapped 20,000 Ukrainian children. So we'll see how they actually will move forward. But we're very grateful to President Donald Trump for making for this commitment to achieving peace. And the fact that that meeting in Jeddah went really well. We got Europe must be involved as part of the joint communique. Intelligence sharing is restored. Military aid is restored. So we're on the right path, and we want to achieve peace more than anybody else. But we want to have a just peace, a peace that will be also sustainable. This is what we're asking for. And for that, we need to make sure that we are strong enough and Russians don't reinvade us 4 years later.
And so as this weekend, this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing takes place with our Australian Prime Minister taking part, is that sort of a demand of Ukraine that there has to be an American security guarantee for that process to actually work, so that fear that you just identified isn't played out?
Oh, look, it's not a demand, it's just a reality that we are facing, and it's not only related to Ukraine, it's related to Europe, because the backbone of European security is based on American commitment to Europe, and which is all solidified in NATO. And that's the reason, because the only time that Article 5 of NATO was invoked was after 9/11, upon the request of the United States of America and European nations, including Australia, which is not a NATO member, including Ukraine, which is also non-NATO member. We sent our troops to Iraq, we sent our troops to Afghanistan, and because we believed that it was the right thing to do, and we responded to Americans' call for help. And I think now it's time to help Europe, and we make that call, Europe is making that call, and we are very grateful that Australia is contributing, that New Zealand is contributing as well. And I think this is very important for the future of this region, for the Pacific, because a lot of the countries here are very vulnerable because they're dependent, they could be coerced. There are big powers in the region. And I think we need to restore that system where laws are respected, where people can trust the UN Charter, where sovereignty is respected. For now, we don't see it. With what Russia has done, it really has undermined everybody.
After the infamous Oval Office incident, is Ukraine's relationship with the US back now to a stable footing?
US has been the biggest contributor to Ukraine, and this is very important to keep this in mind. We have to move forward with America, with Europe, with Australia on board, because that's the only way how we can achieve peace. Because it's peace through strength means the unity. We need to make sure that actually we force Russia into peace. And for that matter, we need to demonstrate that unity and willingness to work together to achieve it. And certainly the contributions that you are making, they're very much welcomed in Ukraine, because for every Ukrainian who knows that Australia, which is so far away, 15,000 kilometers away, and you care about us, is extremely inspiration for the Ukrainian people. They ask me, go and thank those Anzacs who are supporting us, because that's one of those extremely heartening moments for the Ukrainians, seeing Australians, seeing New Zealanders coming and helping Ukraine, sending their military kit, statements from their leaders. I mean, in this very tumultuous and difficult times for Ukraine. But do Ukrainians care about it? They see it, they are thankful, and we will always remember that.
Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, as we mentioned a little earlier in our headlines, former Labor leader Bill Shorten has made an extraordinary intervention on Australia and the US relationship on Channel 7 this morning, saying the government should match any further tariffs on Australia dollar for dollar. Here he was.
Well, at the end of the day, if they keep putting tariffs on all of our goods, then we've got to reciprocate dollar for dollar, tariff for tariff. Now, I don't think we're there yet. I'm saying that at the moment, aluminium and steel, maybe we can withstand those tariffs they put on by Buy Australian. But at a certain point, the people you're negotiating with have got to think you've got an alternative. They've got to think that you mean business. So it's the last thing you want to do. Tariffs don't help anyone. But if President Trump thinks he can push other countries around, sooner or later you have to push back.
Further on Australia's relationship with the United States, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison spoke to UK radio overnight, saying he does not believe Donald Trump's recent moves on the conflict in Ukraine, including halting intelligence sharing, will harm the Five Eyes alliance.
You don't go into all of these particular events as a collective. Everybody has their own capabilities, and there are ways that is shared between all of us. But how individual parties share what they have access to with third parties outside the agreement is a matter for them. So I think there's perhaps a bit of a misunderstanding about how the Five Eyes works.
Well, it's been another enormous week in Australian politics, and it's not going to surprise you if you've been watching throughout the week that Donald Trump has been, well, the biggest part of the Australian political debate too. Let's bring in my Friday panel, political editor of the Daily Telegraph, Herald Sun and the Advertiser, Claire Armstrong, and the A News, Mark Kenny, also the host of the Democracy Sausage podcast. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Let's begin on the coalition of the willing. Sir Keir Starmer has invited Anthony Albanese to join this weekend call. The Prime Minister said something really interesting today. He suggested there's been a break in the bipartisanship on this issue. The Ukrainian Ambassador saw it a bit differently just then. He wants to be very clear that he thinks he's getting support from both political sides. But Mark Kenny, on boots on the ground, it appears that there is a difference developing.
Yes, it does appear there is a difference, and this is over that question about whether Australia would have a military presence in any peacekeeping arrangements on the ground in Ukraine, subject, of course, to there being a peace to enforce. Anthony Albanese has indicated that the government would be open to that. Peter Dutton, on the other hand, who has sort of been more hawkish in some of these things in the past, has pulled back from that and says that that's not an appropriate thing. Now, there's going to be a division of opinion over that, but at the moment, the whole thing is predicated on there being a peace, and that seems to be some way off.
Yeah, it seems like a very much later down the process question. But Claire, the Prime Minister is on this phone call. The peace hasn't been delivered yet, but his view outside when he comes off that phone call will be demanded of him. How is this playing out? Why has Peter Dutton made the call not to be part of this?
I think what Peter Dutton has looked for is a very narrow path that he wants to walk between, obviously being supportive of Ukraine, as we had the Ambassador saying just before, but painting Anthony Albanese as someone who just doesn't understand national security and defence. And this whole argument that he's put forward is essentially one of that, you know, the PM has jumped the gun. There wasn't actually, or there's yet to be, obviously, a request for any kind of boots on the ground operation, let alone the fact that, as Mark said, that's predicated on peace. So I think he's trying to thread the needle on, not necessarily to say that, you know, if a request was made, and particularly, for example, if there were US security guarantees, I think that would almost ensure that Australia would take part in whatever was asked of us, that Dutton is trying to say we're not there, and here is a Prime Minister who is getting too ahead of himself. I'm not sure how that actually plays domestically, because there is obviously quite strong support for helping Ukraine as in its fight against Russia. Yeah, that's an important point. There's polling showing there's strong support for Zelensky among Australians. Broadly, Australians are very, very sympathetic to Ukraine, Mark. Is that a factor, or is this going to press the buttons of people thinking, well, that's too far away, let's not get ourselves involved?
Look, it could be a factor. There's no doubt high support for Ukraine and low support for Trump in the YouGov poll that we've seen. I think it was 69-31 relative to Zelensky relative to Trump. So that's a pretty serious lead that Zelensky has, and there is support for Australia's support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia. So I think that's the situation as we see it at the moment. The question, I suppose, is what happens down the track. At one level, we can see that the opposition is sort of leveraging this idea that Australia's got involved in foreign conflicts far from our shores before, and it hasn't always gone well, places like Afghan and Iraq, for example. And I think there would be a current of Australian opinion that would say, look, yes, it's okay for Australia to support Ukraine, but do we need to actually commit troops on the ground? That's going to be the debate. But as I say, all of this is kind of projected forward and predicated on this idea of there being a peace to enforce. And I think we need to think that through a bit. If there is a peace to enforce, it's because both sides in the conflict, we know there are currently in this discussion about whether there'll be a temporary ceasefire, but it's because both sides in the conflict have reached an accommodation, and there is an agreement not to continue the fighting, and then there would be, you know, peacekeeping forces there to ensure that there weren't any breaches and the like. So it's all a long way down the track, and I think the real political importance of this for Australia at the moment is in its domestic framing as we go into an election. And I think looking at it from that point of view, I think the government's in a stronger position vis-a-vis Ukraine than is the opposition.
Let's just talk about tariffs. This suggestion from Bill Shorten, who only just left Parliament, didn't he, Claire, that we maybe look at reciprocal dollar-for-dollar tariffs for any future tariffs. He did say he wasn't a big fan of tariffs, but that we should consider that. Were you surprised by his intervention?
I don't know if surprised is the right word. He's never shied away from contributing to Australian public debate when he feels he has something to say, and perhaps having stepped outside politics, even though that, as you say, was incredibly recently, that he feels maybe able to say some of the things that are being discussed or thought within the party that maybe can't be said by the leader, who obviously is advocating, you know, Anthony Albanese is advocating against these tariffs on the basis that we do have a free trade agreement with the US, that we are a trading nation and we're supportive of open, fair and free trade. So to have that knee-jerk response of reciprocal tariffs and retaliation would undercut that broader argument that Australia is mounting. I suppose the point Bill Shorten made today was, is Donald Trump the kind of leader and his administration the kind of government that would care for the principled argument and maybe only necessarily respond to like-for-like retaliation?
Yeah, and on that question, I mean, the Prime Minister said no, we don't want to retaliate this way. I think they're quite clear on that, Mark Kenny, but there has to be, obviously, some cards played by the Australian government. So what can they do?
Well, at this stage, as Claire said, I think the operation or the strategy is about sticking to the principle, not overreacting to this, particularly because it is such a small section of our trade that is affected by it. The prospect of further tariffs being placed on agriculture and other things, I think that is a significant concern, and it will present the government, if it does happen, with that question about, well, at what point do you actually show some resolve here? Do you hit back? Do you respond like for like? And who ends up paying for that? I mean, the argument's been put so far, and I think it's a persuasive one, that tariffs would fuel inflation here in Australia and make prices higher for Australian consumers buying American goods. So, you know, none of this is particularly easy. And I thought Shorten's intervention was, I mean, it would be a bit rich of me as an academic formerly involved in the press gallery to be saying that you shouldn't, you know, speak outside the academy, as it were. But I was a little bit surprised that he came out so strongly, so quickly after taking up that role. And I guess some of his colleagues in the government would be thinking, all right, Bill, you know, you've had your turn, you've left now, and perhaps leave us to it.
Yes, they would absolutely be feeling that way. It's getting advice from former leaders is never fun for current Prime Ministers, we know that. Let's move to another story which I've been very intrigued over this week. The Coalition has been dealing with leaks and stories about people being unhappy about economic policy, people being unhappy about their work from home, bringing basically public servants back to the office policy. Claire, I'm a bit surprised, I've got to say, that after a long time of unity, there's a breakout just before an election. Why?
I think the timing is actually quite a bit the answer here, because we are so close to an election, and there was, as you say, there's been quite decent amount of unity within the coalition, and particularly the Liberal Party room, over the last 2.5, 3 years since the last election. But now we are so close to the next election, I think there are some coalition MPs, particularly as the gap between the two major parties has really narrowed, and they've started to think about really possibly being able to secure perhaps enough seats to get a minority government. They're looking around and going, well, what have we offered as the alternative government? And perhaps that faith that there was a process, that things were happening, that particularly the shadow cabinet had this in hand, is now starting to turn into a bit of scepticism and confusion, given we're at most weeks away from an election campaign, and the policy offering from the opposition is not where some of those backbenchers in particular expected it to be at this stage in the cycle. Yeah,
Mark Kenny, I am still surprised. I get what you're saying, Claire, there's a logic to it, but usually, and I've watched politics for a long time, you get the bloodletting and the leaking at the start of a political term, and then it tightens up and discipline increases. So, Mark Kenny, that's the unusual thing, isn't it?
Have they got it round the wrong way, you're saying? I suspect...
Well, kind of. I mean, there is something normal about wanting to have it out after an election. They were very disciplined then, and now it seems that there's a frustration growing.
It's been one of the achievements of Peter Dutton to hold his team together and to hold it to a strategy that at the beginning looked quite risky, that of not going after recovering the people lost to the Teal voters, but really going for Labor voters in the suburbs and regions and so forth. That's been Dutton's strategy. His team has been entirely behind that. But I think the risk they're facing at the moment is they do see some of these polls showing that the race tightening. They do feel that they've got relatively little to fight with because they're pursuing what is effectively a small target strategy. The only thing you could call really big target about what they're doing is their nuclear policy, which is quite radical, of course. But in its own way, that's quite small target as well because it's so far over the horizon. And Peter Dutton himself doesn't even really talk about it very often. So I think there's a sense that Jim Chalmers, as Treasurer, has really towelled up Angus Taylor. Angus Taylor hasn't really been up to the competition there, I don't think. And there's a sense, a bit of a fear amongst some of them that they're going to sort of run an honourable second in this race rather than have a crack at it. And they've left things quite late if they are going to introduce significant policy now and really try and bed it in the minds of Australian voters.
Yeah, well, there were many stories over the last few days. The other one, of course, is the controversy which I mentioned over the working from home policy. Claire, are you getting the signs too that there are people who don't like the message that sends?
I think definitely, particularly you've got MPs in city areas and also candidates who feel that the messaging around work from home, and that's, essentially saying for public servants that it won't be able to be happening unless there's, extenuating circumstances, that has really bled into a broader workforce discussion where it's made to look as though the coalition are opposing more flexibility in the workplace, which specifically hurts those candidates and MPs who are in inner city areas where work from home and flexibility is really important, particularly to professional female voters that have families. So I think that concern is born directly out of the interface that a lot of those MPs are having with their constituents, and that maybe there was support for some sort of measures around the public servants, but it hasn't been explained or curtailed to just limit around that group of people.
Now, there's another story that has been firmed up today. Anthony Albanese attended a political fundraiser on the same day that Peter Dutton flew from Brisbane to Sydney, where he attended, of course, that fundraiser that's been controversial. If I can just start with you, Claire, on that. The Prime Minister, I think, confirmed it in a radio interview on Nova Perth today. The government's arguing there are different circumstances, but it's probably not helpful, this information, is it?
The fundraiser he attended happened earlier in the day to the one Dutton went to. I wonder if Labor would happily give back whatever money was raised to be able to have a much sturdier foundation upon which to yell at Peter Dutton for flying in the opposite direction of the cyclone to go to his fundraiser. I suspect probably. It does make it a bit hard for Labor to capitalise on that as much. And I think looking back, the Prime Minister was very careful in his language when he was asked about the appropriateness of Peter Dutton going to Sydney, even though he was back, in time for the cyclone. And at the time, maybe that was just interpreted as the Prime Minister staying out of the fray, but obviously he knew a bit more. I would have actually said that would have been an opportunity for him to volunteer that information and then probably make his case. The fact that it's, come out a week later looks even worse.
Yeah. What do you think, Mark?
I agree. I think that's a pertinent piece of information that should have come up at the time. You might recall Peter Dutton's words when he was trying to justify his position. He said, the Prime Minister and I are both attending fundraisers. I thought it was interesting that he said that, just because it was an odd thing to have an opposition leader kind of using the Prime Minister as cover. But it turned out to be even more pertinent because they'd both been attending fundraisers on the same day. And so if there was any, there were particularities in relation to Dutton leaving Queensland, going to Sydney and then coming back and, while people are preparing and so forth as a Queenslander himself. But really, I think it was a pertinent piece of information that the PM had been doing the same, and he should have said so at the time. And his ministers, the ones who really teed off on Dutton, I think should have been a bit more careful and forthcoming with that information.
I think so too. That's the bit that I find a bit odd. They went in pretty hard. I'm thinking about people like Murray Watt. They had some good lines, actually. But, Claire, they must have known. I mean, politics 101. If you know, don't you have to think about how that might look in a week?
Absolutely. I think what was Murray Watt's line that Peter Dutton was filling money bags, not sandbags. It looked good at the time, but upon reflection, it has put the Prime Minister in a bit of a tricky situation. Now, they'll argue that his responsibilities were a little bit different from Dutton's, as Mark said before. Dutton is a Queenslander, but I think they were making a principled argument here and really trying to draw parallels. Saying that this was Peter Dutton's Hawaii moment in reference to Scott Morrison going overseas when the bushfires happened in 2019-20. So the fact that they pushed the card out so far, I think they might have still been able to do that, but they had to disclose what at least some people must have known that the Prime Minister had done a similar thing on the very same day.
Yeah, I think so. Guys, you've been such a great panel. Thank you.
Thanks. Patricia.
And that's afternoon briefing for today. We're on iView. If you want to catch up with anything, including that whole panel, you can find us because we stream on YouTube live as well. Stay with us here on the ABC News channel. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. I'll see you next week.